going on the offensive at this time is very difficult for anyone. You suffer extreme casualties, and the Russians are taking hideous casualties when they're advancing. And I think that's what often the media misses, that Russia does, it is advancing and it's taking territory for sure, but they're suffering astonishingly high casualties for the territory they're taking. And the territory they're taking is completely destroyed. It's shelled. It's almost, you have villages and towns that are just razed to the ground.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've had Jimmy Rushton on the show. He's a foreign policy and security expert and a journalist based in Kyiv. We've spoken about what is happening on the ground. We've spoken about what weapons the Ukrainian army need. We've spoken about this conversation yesterday between delegates from Russia and Ukraine. Less than an hour's worth of conversation. There was really nothing to get out of it except another prisoner swap. 1,200 prisoners will be swapped between each country. So that is a good thing that happened out of that. So we speak about whether these peace talks will even continue, Donald Trump's involvement, whether he's willing to send more weaponry and what exactly he needs to send if they need more long-range missiles. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube, or you can stream us as a podcast anywhere you get your podcasts. Jimmy Rushton, Kyiv-based foreign policy and security expert, and of course a journalist. Thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to get straight into what happened yesterday. Russia and Ukrainian delegates, they met for the third peace talks in Istanbul, and as many would expect, it ended with absolutely nothing to really write home about. It was a 40-minute meeting. The only real positive outcome we got from it was that both Russia and Ukraine have agreed to swap around 1,200 prisoners, which was the same outcome we got from the last peace talks. But there's no real update on when this war will end, and negotiations from either side. Russia still wants the same thing. Ukraine still wants the same thing, which is, of course, for Russia to just get out of Ukraine and to live a prosperous life in a sovereign country. So what was your takeaway from the meeting yesterday, Jimmy? Is it time to kind of retire these peace talks?
Well, I think as long as there's still at least a tiny positive from these talks, which is that we've had these prisoner exchanges, which means that, we've had thousands of, 1,200 actually to be precise, Ukrainian prisoners of war coming home from often brutal conditions in Russian jails. I think that's a positive, but I agree with you that there really is no progress towards ending this war. And that is fundamentally because the sides are so misaligned in what they want, right? Russia wants to take the entirety of these 4 oblasts, and the Ukrainians obviously don't want that to happen. The Russians also want the Ukrainian government to, in their terms, be denazified and demilitarized, which is essentially code for unconditional surrender, right? They want the Ukrainian military to disappear. They want the Zelensky government to leave power. And obviously those terms are completely unacceptable for the Ukrainian people, and for the Ukrainian government, and for the Ukraine's European allies, which obviously they don't want Ukraine to be militarily defeated.
It feels like we're going in roundabouts, of course, because as you mentioned, Ukraine is asking for the same things. They're not going to give up any more territory, or the territory that Russia occupies already. They're not going to give up security guarantees. And Russia's not going to give up the fact that they don't want Ukraine to have security guarantees, and they want to be able to keep the areas that they occupy. They want Crimea to be Russian territory, and so on and so forth. But Kyiv, within this meeting, Jimmy, they set a deadline for August for there to be a peace summit held with Russia. Would it make a difference if we did see Putin and Zelensky meet for the first time since the war began?
I don't think so, because even if they meet, they're still going to have these wildly misaligned conditions that they both have for ending the conflict. So I think, again, until fundamentally Ukraine can't stop fighting, because if Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ceases to exist. Russia can always stop this war, and there's really that mismatch here that from the Russian perspective, they feel that they can gain more on the battlefield than they can in peace talks, whereas for the Ukrainians, if they stop fighting, they cease to exist. So, neither side fundamentally has an incentive to agree to stop fighting at the moment. And the only way that you can force the Russians to stop fighting is by increasing the costs that they're paying on the battlefield. And that means, in brutally honest terms, more Russian soldiers being killed, more damage to Russian infrastructure from Ukrainian long-range weapons, and more damage to the Russian economy via sanctions from Ukraine's Western allies.
We're going to get into all of that and what Ukraine's allies need to do economically, but of course in the terms of more aid via weapons. But you've spent the last few days out in Kyiv, where you of course live there, at these protests, Jimmy. But I want to read out what Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, she tweeted this in response to a video going viral of a protest happening in Kyiv. She said, huge protests erupt in Kyiv against Ukrainian President Zelensky, as he is a dictator and refuses to make a peace deal and end the war. Good for the Ukrainian people, throw him out of office, and America must stop funding and sending weapons. So how wrong did she get this?
Well, no, she's completely wrong. The protest wasn't about the war, really, at all. It was about very controversial changes to the independence of two Ukrainian anti-corruption authorities. And it wasn't really anti-Zelensky at all. The crowd wanted him to listen to them, but they didn't want him out of office. I didn't see any protesters or placards calling for him to be removed. I saw a lot of placards and protesters really criticizing him, in very strong terms. But the majority of the criticism was reserved for members of the presidential office, Andriy Yermak, particularly. And yeah, that they want him to listen to them, but it absolutely wasn't about ending the war. And in fact, they were chanting very anti-Russian slogans as well. Putin hulo, which is, I'm not going to translate it, but you can get the idea. It's not complimentary. So yeah, no, she was completely wrong. And as she lies. If her lips are moving, she's lying. She's a pathological liar, and nothing she says can ever be trusted.
Are Ukrainians, when you're speaking to everyday Ukrainians, Jimmy, you're speaking to military members all the time, are you finding that they're still very much in favour of Zelensky and the way he's been handling the war?
Yeah. I think you need to separate that question. So they are in favour of him at times, and when you speak to Ukrainians, there isn't a cult of personality cult surrounding Zelensky here at all. People are very measured in their support and their criticism of him. People that support him will say, yeah, okay, I support him, I'd vote for him again, but he's made some mistakes and he needs to move some people out of his presidential office that they don't like. Particularly Andriy Yermak, who is, he's very unpopular here amongst average Ukrainians. And people that criticize him will say, I think he's made too many mistakes and I think he should go after the war. But I have to admit that he did some good things and he was very good at marshalling international support for Ukraine. And he's been charismatic and he's been an inspirational leader. So, people are rarely all good or all bad. And I think Ukrainian public opinion on Zelensky definitely reflects that it's far more nuanced than, people in the West seem to understand.
Jimmy, 10 days ago, the United States approved selling billions of dollars worth of US weapons to European allies who would in turn transfer that to Ukraine. So has all the weaponry arrived in Ukraine and has it made a difference so far?
No, I mean, a lot of this stuff will be long lead items, so Patriot missile batteries, other air defense equipment, and a variety of other, very high-tech weaponry, which, it takes a long time to deliver. The Germans are in negotiations to get equipment into Ukraine. There has been a delivery of some air defense equipment. I'm not going to go into particularly great detail, but some air defense equipment has arrived, which is great. But yeah, I mean, we're looking probably early 2026 for the Patriot missile batteries to arrive, which, I mean, people have been criticizing the Germans for taking that long, but to be honest, this is very complicated, sensitive equipment, and it does take time to prepare it for transfer. Also, the Germans, quite rightly, they want to see this equipment replaced, so they don't want to compromise their own national security. And the Germans have also done a lot for Ukraine. I think a lot of people miss the amount of aid, financial support that Germany has provided to Ukraine, because it's incredibly significant.
Well, on that note, because if this stockpile isn't coming until early 2026, Jimmy, and then analysts were warning that Biden's stockpile that he sent over was going to run out by the next few months, and of course Russia's kept up this summer of offensiveness. So is that the intel that you have found from the military, that this stockpile from the US is running out?
So I don't think there's any cliff edge. I think that obviously some systems that Biden procured on long lead contracts are actually due to arrive all the way up to 2028, if I remember correctly. So, and we are seeing obviously that there was that brief pause in military aid that was promised to Ukraine that Hegseth put into place, but that's been lifted now. So a lot of the equipment that was paused, just sitting in Poland waiting to be sent to Ukraine, is now flown into Ukraine, which is fantastic. And I think what you're also seeing is the replacement of the presidential drawdown authority military aid that was being sent to Ukraine essentially for free. That's now being replaced by military aid sent to Ukraine on a commercial basis, supplied by European countries and supplied by the US. So I don't think there's going to be a cliff edge. I think what you'll see is probably the kind of the free military aid drying up. But that'll be replaced by military aid provided on a commercial basis. And in some cases, a lot of this aid is purchased via proceeds of frozen Russian funds. So it doesn't actually cost donor countries anything to send it either, which is, ideal.
Jimmy, on the note of weapons and what Ukraine needs, the US has approved to sell $322 million worth of Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and Hawk surface-to-air missile systems. So how much of a difference will this make to Ukraine's air defence, but also on the ground?
So yeah, Bradley infantry fighting vehicles are incredibly effective. I've spoken to a bunch of guys that use them in the field, and they absolutely love them. In fact, they view them as better than tanks, right? They're more versatile, they can carry people, and they have a incredibly effective autocannon, which just tears up enemy infantry. They're also smaller, more easy to maintain, lighter. So yeah, no, they're great. Any supply of these Bradleys to Ukraine will be a massive force multiplier for them. In regards to the Hawk air defense systems, they're also very effective. I mean, they're an older system, but that really doesn't matter because the stuff that they'll be shooting down but a lot of it is not particularly sophisticated either. So, what we've seen in Ukraine, actually, interesting enough, is that some of the older systems have performed very, very well. So, like the Gepard air defense AAA vehicles from Germany, which is essentially a tank with a big autocannon, dual autocannon mounted on it. That's been exceptionally successful at shooting down these Shahid drones. Ukrainians can't get enough of them, and these were produced in the 1970s. We've seen these Hawk missiles, which are very, very good at shooting down Shahids as well, and cruise missiles, and they were produced starting from end of the 1950s as well. So this stuff it might be old, but it still works. It still works pretty well.
What else, when you're speaking to the military, is there anything specific that they say that they would need from the US to approve, or even broker the same situation with NATO, where NATO is paying for it? Is long-range missile systems what they need the most? Because, of course, they're trying to cover as much ground as they can into Russian territory.
So yeah, that's very important. Also, just on a kind of a lower tactical level, cluster munitions for the 155mm artillery that they have. So DPICM, it's incredibly effective at breaking up Russian assaults. It's far more effective than unitary 155 high explosive shells. So that's what they need. They also need support for weapons manufacturing actually in Ukraine. So like they can build a lot of stuff in Ukraine, and it's relatively cheap for them to build here. But Ukrainian munitions factories just don't have the funding to operate to their full capacity at the moment. So if we can fund them directly, or, again, we could use the proceeds of Russian assets, frozen Russian assets in the West, to produce weapons inside Ukraine, it's very effective. They also need a lot of air defense. So gun-based air defense systems, are very important. And the reason why gun-based air defense systems are so important is because the cost per engagement, when you're talking about taking down these Shahids, which are launched in huge numbers, so hundreds a night, you can't fire enough surface-to-air missiles to successfully engage all of these. So what you need really is gun-based air defense systems, because the cost per engagement is far, far less, and it's a sustainable way of taking down these Shahids. Surface-to-air missiles aren't. You might use them in absolutely desperate circumstances, but you want to take down the majority of these weapons using gun-based air defense systems or FPV interceptor drones, which are coming online in greater numbers now.
The Ukrainian army, they've been hitting Moscow a lot in the last week or so. They did 5 straight days of hitting into Moscow, Jimmy, especially as Russia has been hitting into Kyiv as well. So both hitting each other's capitals. But has the Ukrainian army been making a lot of strides with these attacks?
I mean, it's difficult to know. I think, you have seen very successful attacks on Russian infrastructure, particularly some of the arsenals that they've struck, some oil refineries and fuel depots, airfields. They've been very successful. It's difficult to know exactly how effective strikes in and around Moscow will be. And I do think there's a psychological element of bringing the war home to Russians, that they need to understand that this is not a conflict that's just taking place in a faraway country. It's a conflict that is coming home to them. So it's very disruptive. But I ultimately, I think, for the Ukrainian perspective, the war will ultimately be decided on the battlefield in Ukraine, and the long-range strike program is absolutely important, especially when it's targeting those targets that I mentioned earlier. But fundamentally, it's going to be decided here in Ukraine, and if you can get the upper hand on the fields of this country.
Who do you feel like has the upper hand right now?
It's very much dependent what section of the front that you're talking about. So down in Pokrovsk, the Russians are definitely making progress. In Sumy, north of Sumy, Ukrainians have stopped the Russian advance, and they're beating them back in most cases. Around Izium, the front is relatively stable. That doesn't mean the Russians aren't pushing and suffering huge casualties there, but they're just not getting anywhere, because the Ukrainian soldiers in that area are very, very tough, determined, well-disciplined. But yeah, no, it's difficult. And, obviously the Ukrainian strategy is essentially trade land for time and land for Russian dead, right? So they're not trying to mount any kind of no-step back, last-ditch defenses of territory. They are ceding territory in order to kill Russians. And that really is probably the most optimum strategy for them at this point, because going on the offensive at this time is very difficult for anyone. You suffer extreme casualties, and the Russians are taking hideous casualties when they're advancing. And I think that's what often the media misses, that Russia does, it is advancing and it's taking territory for sure, but they're suffering astonishingly high casualties for the territory they're taking. And the territory they're taking is completely destroyed. It's shelled. It's almost, you have villages and towns that are just razed to the ground almost, because they've been fighting over these areas so ferociously for months. So what is Russia gaining from this slow grinding advance in Ukraine? Okay, they can say on a map, look, we've captured X amount of kilometers of territory, but it has no practical use to Russia. And earlier this week, residents of Donetsk and Luhansk were told that they're not going to have water for the majority of their time. This has been a continuing problem, by the way, in the Russian-occupied territories. So Russia just doesn't, provide basic services to the people that live there. And Donetsk has been in Russian hands for, nearly a decade. And yeah, the people have no running water. You can't flush toilets in Donetsk, so people are literally defecating in plastic bags and then throwing it out the window. It's just absolutely, it's disgusting. And these are the conditions that Russians are living in, and this is the territory that Russia has conquered. And what are they doing with it? Well, absolutely nothing. And they've just destroyed the lives of pretty much everyone in these territories. Even the people that call themselves pro-Russian are complaining about this, because Russia's just completely abandoned these people. So yeah, what is Russia gaining for this monumental slaughter of Russian and Ukrainian lives? in Ukraine. Absolutely nothing. It's complete madness. It really is.
But Jimmy, if that's the case and Russian casualties are so high, as you say, the way in which Ukraine could hit them even further is with the help of the United States by invoking these sanctions on Russia, because we of course know that Putin does use a lot of conscription to get Russian soldiers to become soldiers, but he's also paying them such high wages. And in order to stop him being able to pay soldiers money and for families to be able to let their husbands go out and fight, is that they can't afford to pay it. So you and I spoke off camera about this bill being put forward by Lindsey Graham. It's a sanctions bill that was introduced in April. It's been stalled and stalled and stalled. The bill would basically slap any country importing Russian energy with a 500% tariff. The main culprits of this would be India and China. Donald Trump, he was supposedly green-lighting it a few weeks ago, but then the update is that he wants to do this unilaterally, which would mean basically he's going to follow through with his 50-day ultimatum and not invoke and basically not let senators vote on this bill. And now they're on recess, so he's just stalled yet again. So 83 senators out of 100 on a bipartisan level have supported this bill. So it just goes to show that they are, for one of the first times, united on the fact that US Congress should be slapping Donald Trump, should be approving this, slapping these countries with this 500% tariff, which would in turn cripple Russia's economy so that they cannot afford to pay these soldiers. So is this the answer? Is this the saving grace that could help Ukraine?
So I think sanctions are part of the answer, but they're not the whole solution. You're absolutely right. They're paying a lot of money to soldiers to fight and almost certainly die or be wounded in this war. And you're actually seeing whole sections of Russian society and communities in Russia that are, it's like a massive fiscal stimulus, right? That's based around the death of Russian soldiers. It's incredibly bizarre. But I think what you're seeing is that this is creating inflationary pressure in Russia. The Russian government has admitted as much. Interest rates are very, very high. And I think the economy is definitely struggling. And if you look at statements from the Russian government, they will admit that. So I think it's an important part of the answer. From Trump's perspective, I do find it a little bit puzzling, because if you look at his decision to supply weapons to Ukraine, albeit on a commercial basis, that was overwhelmingly popular with both the American general public and Republicans. In fact, supporting Ukraine is one of the few things that he can do which is actually genuinely popular in America. And I would have thought, considering all of the troubles that he's in with Epstein and everything else, that he'd want to be doing stuff which is genuinely popular. It seems like a no-brainer to me. I mean, his motivations are, the only person that can divine his motivations are himself. But I think, he does like to kick the can down the road. I mean, that's been clear from day one. And I think with Trump, it's never been about, he was never going to wake up and become a Russia hawk. It's always been about getting him to a position where he can do the least amount of damage to Ukraine as possible. And I think careful diplomacy from the Ukrainian government and Ukraine's European allies has gotten him to a point where he's sending weapons to Ukraine. Again, it's on a commercial basis, but it's still incredibly important. And that is the most important thing. It'd be amazing if he just decided to implement wide-ranging sanctions on Russia and secondary sanctions on countries that buy Russian oil. But I don't know if that's going to happen, unfortunately.
The other option was Reuters was reporting that perhaps Trump should go directly to India and ask them to stop buying Russian oil, and then go directly to Saudi and ask them to start pumping more oil so that there was no gap in the market, prices didn't go higher. And it was this better relationship between the US and India. So we'll see if that happens. But Jimmy Rushton, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thanks so much.